1652, when the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, established a supply station at the Cape of Good Hope under the leadership of Jan van Riebeeck. The goal was simple: to create a resupply point for VOC ships traveling between Europe and the East Indies, allowing them to stock up on fresh water, meat, and vegetables. The Cape was perfectly located halfway between Europe and Asia. This was before the Suez Canal existed. The Cape's temperate climate and fertile soil made it an ideal spot for farming, and soon the small outpost began to grow. While the original plan was purely logistical, the success of the settlement sparked ambition. Dutch settlers, known as Boers, a Dutch word meaning farmers, began pushing inland in search of more fertile land for agriculture and livestock. To fuel this expansion and keep the colony running, the VOC turned to slave labor. In 1658, just 6 years after the settlement began, the first slaves were imported to the Cape, a group of Angolans captured from a Portuguese ship. Over time, thousands more were brought from Mozambique, Madagascar, Indonesia, India, and Sri Lanka, performing hard labor on farms, in households, and in service of the VOC. This expansion brought them into direct conflict with the Khoikhoi, the region's original inhabitants, led by chiefs like Outshamato and Doman. For thousands of years, the Khoikhoi had lived as pastoralists and herders across the Cape. But as more land was seized by the Dutch, tensions escalated. What started as competition over grazing land and water quickly turned into a full-scale conflict. The Khoikhoi-Dutch Wars began in 1659 and continued intermittently into the 1670s. Were among the first violent confrontations between European settlers and indigenous African communities. Armed with superior weapons and supported by the VOC, the Dutch settlers gradually displaced the Khoikhoi from their ancestral lands, shattering their traditional way of life. By the 1700s, the Dutch frontier pushed even farther east. This time, they encountered the Xhosa, a powerful and organized Bantu-speaking people who had long lived along the eastern Cape frontier. What followed was over a century of intermittent warfare, known as the Cape Frontier Wars, a series of 9 major conflicts fought between 1779 and 1879, as both Boer settlers and later the British Empire clashed with the Xhosa over land, cattle, and control. The Europeans viewed Xhosa territory as both fertile farmland and a strategic buffer. But for the Xhosa, the land was far more than just soil. It was a source of identity, history, and survival. But colonial forces deployed scorched earth tactics, burning homes, seizing cattle, and forcibly displacing entire communities. The Xhosa were gradually overwhelmed by superior European firepower and imperial strategy. But war wasn't the only thing that broke the Xhosa. In 1856, a 15-year-old girl named Nonka Wuse claimed the ancestors had spoken that if the Xhosa killed their cattle and destroyed their crops, the colonizers would vanish, and a new era would begin. Her uncle, a respected prophet, believed her, and so did thousands more. By early 1857, over 400,000 cattle were slaughtered, but the prophecy never came true. Instead, hunger swept the land. More than 40,000 died. The Xhosa, once fierce resistors, were left devastated, not just by guns, but by hope turned to tragedy. Around the same time that the Xhosa were still resisting colonial expansion in the East, another major shift was happening in the Cape. In 1795, during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch to prevent it from falling into the hands of the French-controlled Batavian Republic, which had replaced the Dutch monarchy. The Cape was too valuable to lose. But in 1803, under the Treaty of Amiens, a brief peace in Europe, Britain agreed to return the Cape to the Dutch, now represented by the Batavian Republic. However, peace didn't last. When war resumed between Britain and France, the British feared that the Cape could once again fall under French influence. So in 1806, they launched a full invasion. The key moment came at the Battle of Blouberg, just north of Cape Town. British forces under Sir David Baird defeated the Batavian defenders, securing British control of the Cape permanently. This marked the start of over a century of British rule in South Africa. The British introduced a new style of colonial administration, more centralized, English-speaking, and reform-driven. They changed the legal system, enforced English in schools and courts, and in 1834 abolished slavery across the empire. For the Boers, these changes were intolerable. Many relied on enslaved labor for their farms, and they saw British policies as a threat to their autonomy, language, and faith. The result was the Great Trek, a mass exodus of Boer families into the interior to escape British control. One of the leading figures was Piet Retief, who believed the Boers needed a land of their own. So in 1837, he led a group inland, hoping to negotiate land directly from local rulers. As the conflict between the Boer, the Xhosa, and the British was happening, another power was rising to the northeast, the Zulu. In 1816, the Zulu had just lost their leader, King Senzangakona. His son, Shaka Zulu, seized power by overthrowing his brother Sigujana and quickly transformed a relatively minor chiefdom into one of the most formidable military forces in southern Africa. Through military innovation, brutal discipline, and a centralized command structure, Shaka expanded the kingdom's reach and redefined warfare with tactics like the buffalo horn formation and the short stabbing spear. But as his empire grew, so did his paranoia and cruelty. Shaka ordered mass executions, banned the planting of crops during mourning, and became increasingly erratic. Even his own family was not safe, and few felt it more keenly than his half-brothers, Dayangani and Mklangana. Dayangani, the more calculating of the two, watched Shaka grow more isolated. With the help of Mklangana and a trusted Induna named Mbopa, he devised a plan to remove Shaka from power. In September 1828, while Shaka was recovering from illness at his kraal in Kwadukuza, Mbopa struck first, stabbing the king. Dingane and Mklangana joined in, and Shaka, the architect of the Zulu nation, was dead. His body was buried in a secret grave. After the assassination, Dingane wasted no time consolidating power. He had Mklangana executed and purged dozens of Shaka's supporters, fearing they might turn against him. But ruling was not so simple. Dingane inherited a military still loyal to his brother's memory, and a court fractured by years of fear and brutality. To stabilize his reign, Dingane moved the capital to Umgungundlovu, a vast royal kraal in present-day KwaZulu-Natal, where he governed through a mix of diplomacy and violence. Unlike Shaka, who led from the front lines, Dingane often relied on his Indunas to relay his commands and enforce his rule. Despite lacking Shaka's charisma and military genius, Dingane kept the kingdom together, at least for a time. But challenges mounted. Internal unrest festered. The Ndebele under Mzilikazi, once a Zulu general, had broken away and were forming a rival state to the north. Other African groups like the Hlubi and Swazi were becoming more assertive. In the early 1830s, a group of raiders, acting under a rival chief named Chief Sekonyela, stole cattle from the royal herds. For the Zulu, cattle were not just wealth, but a symbol of power, legitimacy, and spiritual favor. The theft was more than an insult. It was a direct challenge to Dingane's authority. Angry and humiliated, Dingane sought a way to recover the stolen cattle and send a message to his enemies. Around this time, a group of Voortrekkers led by Piet Retief arrived at his court, asking for land. Dingane told Retief about the stolen cattle and made it clear. No land would be discussed until the cattle were returned. Seeing an opportunity, Retief volunteered to recover the cattle, hoping it would earn Dingane's trust and secure land for his people. In Dingane's eyes, Retief wasn't just another settler. He was an outsider who could be used as a tool to restore order and prove to rivals, both internal and external, that the king still held power. Retief recovered cattle stolen from Dingane by a rival chief, a gesture of goodwill meant to earn the Zulu king's trust. After returning the cattle, Retief and his delegation were invited to a celebration at Umgungundlovu, Dingane's royal kraal. But things took a dark turn. Following Zulu custom, Retief's party left their weapons outside before the feast. At Dingane's command, reportedly uttered as Bulalani Abatakati, which means kill the wizards, Retief and his entire group were ambushed and brutally killed. Their bodies were left to rot, a chilling message to the other trekkers. Dingane saw the Boers not as allies but as invaders who posed a threat to his kingdom, especially as they moved deeper into Zulu territory. His preemptive strike was brutal, but in his eyes necessary. Retief's death shocked the Voortrekkers, who now faced the very real threat of Zulu annihilation. Enter Andries Pretorius, a new leader who quickly organized a well-armed force to defend the settlers and avenge the massacre. Pretorius was strategic and deeply religious. He and his men took a solemn vow to God. If they were victorious, they would build a church and honor the day of the battle forever. This vow became central to Afrikaner identity. On December 16, 1838, Pretorius led about 470 Boers to the banks of the Encom River, where they formed a defensive circle with their wagons, a lager. Across the river, over 10,000 Zulu warriors prepared to attack. The Battle of Blood River was swift and deadly. The Zulu, armed with assegais and shields, charged in waves but were met with disciplined musket fire and cannons. The Boers held their ground, and the casualties were staggering. Over 3,000 Zulu warriors killed, while the Boers suffered almost no losses. After Daingane's defeat following the Battle of Blood River, his half-brother Mpande saw an opportunity. He broke away with thousands of followers, allied himself with the Voortrekkers, and in 1840, with their help, he defeated Daingane and took the throne. But Mpande wasn't your classic warrior king like Shaka. He was more of a political survivor. He ruled for over 30 years, not through sheer strength, but by playing everyone off each other. British, Boers, even his own sons. And that's where Cetshwayo enters the picture. But before that, the Boers moved quickly to establish their own government. They set up the Natalia Republic, with Pietermaritzburg as its capital. This was the Voortrekkers' dream, a land free from British control where they could rule themselves. But the British had no intention of letting a Boer republic sit along the valuable southeastern coast. In 1842, the British launched a military campaign and defeated the Boers at the Battle of Khangela. By 1843, they formally annexed the Natalia Republic, forcing the Boers to abandon their settlement and head further inland. Feeling betrayed and determined to live independently, many Boers undertook a second migration known as the Great Trek's Inland Phase. They moved north and founded two new republics, the South African Republic, Transvaal in 1852, and the Orange Free State in 1854. These republics became the heartland of Boer identity, isolated, self-reliant, and fiercely resistant to British influence. Now back to the Zulu kingdom. Mpande had many sons, but two in particular, Cetshwayo and Mbuyasi, were locked in a power struggle. Mpande favored Mbuyasi, even though Cetshwayo was older and had way more support among the Zulu warriors and generals. The tension exploded in 1856 at the Battle of Dondakusuka. It was brother versus brother. Cetshwayo's forces annihilated Mbuyasi's army, killing not only his rival, but 6 of Mpande's sons and thousands of their followers. Some were even swept into the Tugela River and devoured by crocodiles. Brutal. After that, Cetshwayo was basically king in all but name. Mpande stayed on the throne, but everyone knew who really had the power. When Mpande died in 1872, Cetshwayo officially became king. His rule was about restoring military pride and Zululand's independence. He rebuilt the regiments, reintroduced strict discipline, and modernized the army where he could. But this worried the British. They saw the new strong Zulu army as a threat, especially since the British were now pushing for complete control over southern Africa. And there was a reason for that, because a few years earlier in 1867, a 15-year-old boy named Erasmus Jacobs picked up a shiny stone on his family's farm along the Orange River. That stone turned out to be the 21-carat Eureka diamond, and it would spark South Africa's first diamond rush. But the land it was found on, known as Griqualand West, was a political battleground. It was home to the Griqua people, led by Nicholas Waterboer and surrounded by African chiefdoms, Boer settlers, and the expanding British Cape Colony. No one had full control, but once diamonds entered the picture, that would change. Thousands of prospectors flooded the region. In 1871, using a shaky agreement with Waterboer, the British annexed the land officially absorbing it into the Cape Colony. So the British gave Cetewayo an ultimatum: disband your army, accept British protection, and basically give up your sovereignty. Cetewayo refused. This started the Anglo-Zulu War. In January 1879, British forces crossed into Zululand, expecting a swift victory. But on January 22nd, at the Battle of Isandlwana, the unthinkable happened. Over 20,000 Zulu warriors, armed with spears and shields, outmaneuvered and annihilated a British column of nearly 1,800 soldiers. It was the worst defeat ever inflicted on a modern British army by indigenous forces. The world was stunned, but the British soon regrouped, bringing overwhelming firepower, thousands of reinforcements, and a scorched earth strategy. On July 4th, they attacked Ulundi, the Zulu capital. The battle was brutal. Gatling guns versus assegais, and the Zulus were crushed. Cetewayo was captured and exiled to Cape Town, later to London. The British then dismantled the kingdom, splitting Zululand into 13 rival chiefdoms, deliberately sowing division. With that, the reign of powerful, independent Zulu kings effectively ended. Meanwhile, the British Empire also annexed the Transvaal under the pretext of protecting it from Zulu attacks. The Boers saw this as imperial bullying. By 1880, they'd had enough. Led by Paul Kruger, they revolted. Armed with long-range Mauser rifles and unmatched knowledge of the terrain, the Boers fought a guerrilla-style campaign. At Majuba Hill in 1881, they stunned the world by annihilating a British force on a mountaintop. One of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. The war was short but effective. Britain, not wanting a prolonged conflict, recognized Transvaal's independence. For now. Then in 1886, massive gold deposits were found in the Witwatersrand, turning Johannesburg into the gold capital of the world almost overnight. Suddenly, the Transvaal wasn't just a stubborn frontier republic. It sat on some of the richest land on Earth. The British wanted it back. In 1899, they launched a full-scale invasion. This time they came prepared. But so did the Boers. The Boers returned to their hit-and-run tactics, ambushing supply lines, sniping patrols, and vanishing into the veld. They were expert horsemen and sharpshooters, but the British response was ruthless. Under Lord Kitchener, the British implemented a scorched earth policy, torching farms, destroying food supplies, and building blockhouses connected by barbed wire fences to trap Boer fighters. Worse still, they imprisoned Boer civilians, mostly women and children, in concentration camps under horrific conditions. Nearly 28,000 of them died from disease, hunger, and neglect. By 1902, the Boers were exhausted. Their land was destroyed, their people decimated. They surrendered, and the British annexed both Boer republics. The British had won, but at a brutal cost. South Africa was battered, divided, and bleeding. The country was technically at peace, but tensions still simmered. Boer farms had been burned to ash. British soldiers were buried across the veld, and black South Africans, who had been caught in the crossfire or exploited for labor, were left with nothing but scars. To consolidate control, Britain pushed for unification. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was born, combining the Cape Colony, Natal, the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State into a single self-governing dominion of the British Empire. It had one flag, one government, but it was far from one nation. Power was placed firmly in white hands. The new government was dominated by British and Afrikaner elites. Louis Botha, a former Boer general, became the first prime minister in 1910, while the British monarch remained head of state. Meanwhile, the black majority, over 80% of the population, was completely excluded from political power. This wasn't just segregation. It was the legal blueprint for a racial caste system. The exclusion wasn't just felt, it was answered. In 1912, a group of mission-educated black South Africans, teachers, lawyers, journalists, and chiefs, formed the South African Native National Congress, later renamed the African National Congress. Key founders included figures like Pixley K.I. Isakasim, John Dewey, and Sol Plaatje. Many of them had studied at prestigious mission schools and universities like Fort Hare, Lovedale, or even overseas in the US and Britain. They represented a new generation, educated, politically conscious, and determined to be heard. At first, their methods were respectful and restrained. They believed in the British promise of justice. They wrote letters, organized delegations, and traveled to London to plead for fair treatment. But they were mostly ignored. In 1913, the Natives Land Act struck the first major legislative blow. It prohibited Black South Africans from buying, renting, or owning land outside of designated native reserves, which made up just 7% of South Africa's land, despite the Black population being the vast majority. These reserves were deliberately placed far from cities and mines. They were overcrowded, underdeveloped, and stripped of opportunity. It was legalized land theft, and it forced thousands of Black families off fertile land into poverty. The ANC immediately protested, launching one of its first national campaigns. But again, the government didn't budge. By the 1920s, South Africa's economy was booming. For some, gold and diamonds were flowing like never before. The country was becoming the economic engine of the continent. But behind that prosperity was a brutal system. Black labor built white wealth. Black men were recruited from rural areas in neighboring countries like Mozambique, Lesotho, and Malawi to work in the mines. These weren't jobs, they were sentences. Miners lived in cramped, fenced-off compounds, far from their families, under strict surveillance. They earned pennies while white supervisors raked in profits. The government enforced this with a system of pass laws, documents that restricted where Black people could go, live, or work. Without a pass, you could be arrested on the spot. It was control disguised as order. At the same time, land hunger worsened. The 1913 Land Act was just the beginning. A 1936 amendment, the Native Trust and Land Act, promised to increase land for Black ownership from 7% to 13%. But even that land remained under state control, and most Black South Africans still had nowhere to go. Trade unions began to rise, especially in the late 1920s and early 30s. Black workers started organizing, striking for better pay and conditions, especially on the mines and railways. The Industrial and Commercial Workers Union became one of the biggest mass movements in South Africa in the late 1920s, rallying workers from Cape Town to Zimbabwe. The ANC, meanwhile, remained cautious and elite-driven. Its leadership was mostly middle class, focused on polite petitions and cautious reform. But a new generation of thinkers was watching. They saw that polite resistance wasn't enough. Change, real change, would take something bigger. As the Union solidified, so did its symbols. In 1928, South Africa adopted a new flag, a tricolor of orange, white, and blue, with three smaller flags crammed in the center: the Union Jack, the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State flag. It was a compromise between British and Afrikaner identity, but for Black South Africans, it was a clear symbol of exclusion. As World War II approached, another powerful force was rising: Afrikaner nationalism. Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch settlers, had long felt marginalized by British rule. Many still carried bitterness from the Anglo-Boer Wars and the destruction of their republics. Now they began organizing politically, culturally, and economically. The Broederbond, a secretive Afrikaner male-only society, worked behind the scenes to promote Afrikaner unity, language, and control. In 1914, they formed the National Party, but it was in the 1930s and 40s that it really gained traction. They pushed for a South Africa run by Afrikaners, for Afrikaners, with white supremacy at its core. Many admired Nazi Germany and flirted with fascist ideas. In fact, during World War II, some Afrikaners opposed South Africa joining the war on the side of Britain at all. By the end of the war, the political climate had shifted. In 1948, the National Party won the general election, and with it, they introduced the world to a new word: apartheid, which is a Dutch word for apartness.